Good afternoon, everyone. This is Liz from Violence Free Colorado. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this webinar on creating and sustaining volunteer programs. So as we move through the presentation, please feel free to type questions in the chat or the Q&A function, either one, whichever one's easier for you to use. And I'll try to answer them in the moment, but if I miss some, I'll go back at the end and answer any that I missed. I would love to have your questions. And so really our goal for today is to give you some tools and strategies to help support you as you're building volunteer programs. And we know that, just about every program in the state has an existing volunteer program, but we also know that sometimes due to turnover or changes in the structure and the agency or just getting really busy, sometimes it's hard to maintain that. And so hopefully by giving you some foundational tools, we'll make that a little bit easier and the project will be more sustainable in the long run. So our goals for today are to talk about setting strategic goals for the volunteer program, handling challenging volunteer situations, building sustainability, and then what kind of support that we can provide to you as you're going through either in the startup phase, but also just as you're working with volunteers in an ongoing basis, how can we support you in that work? So I grabbed this wheel, and I think it's really telling, right? So I think a lot of folks can relate to this experience in the nonprofit world, is that we realize that our community needs are larger than our ability to meet those needs, right? And we do everything we can to try and meet those needs when they exceed our capacity. And one way we do that is with volunteers. But because it is really hard to build in the time and space within your work, when you're seeing such a huge need in the community, it's really hard to take time out to build these programs. And so you get stuck kind of in this cycle of bringing on volunteers to meet a really important need and something that you really need help working on, but because you don't have the time and space to dedicate to those volunteers, they're not always successful, or they become something that is a drain on your program instead of a support to it. So our hope is that we can give you some tips and tools that you can use, and you can build some time into your work to support volunteers, which I'm going to make the argument that will come back to you, tenfold when you have a group of volunteers that are well trained and well supervised. They can be an amazing support both to the survivors you work with and to your staff, right? So if you've ever felt like, I wish I could take some things off of my fellow staff members' plate so they have more time and space to focus on the needs of survivors, a well-developed volunteer program might be able to help you with that. So how do you build a volunteer program? So there are two really key things that can set you up for success, and that is building them strategically and purposefully. And it is really a challenge to make space and time when you're providing emergency services to have that. But I promise that it is worth it. And so I've included a link in the chat box to a tool. So hopefully you can purposefully build some time into your schedule to really think about what your volunteer needs are, and that document can be an aid to you in that time. And I really encourage folks to actually put some time on their calendar to think about and develop their volunteer program. Even if you're just meeting with yourself, like even if you just want to put a meeting on your calendar that's for an hour long, and you're going to be in your office or wherever is best, just having some set aside time to think about volunteers can be really helpful. But it also can be really helpful to bring in staff members in there, talk to them about what their needs and experiences are with volunteers. That can also be a really great support to you. So steps to creating a strategic and personal volunteer program. The first one is to set some goals, right? And so when we're clear about our intentions from the beginning, that is going to help us really identify the best strategies to reach those goals. So a couple of reasons to why should you develop a strategic plan. It'll improve your outcomes. Volunteer hours are worth, this is just one report, there are lots of, you can find lots of different research on there, but are worth $24 an hour, right? So if you think about, just from a purely practical standpoint, if that's what you're getting back from a group of volunteers, you investing a couple of hours a week, or another staff person investing a couple of hours a week into training and supporting those, over time, that's really going to pay off for you. Having a plan really helps with retention and experience of volunteers. You know, just like anybody else, any of us, when we are unclear of what our role is, or we're feeling confusion or overwhelmed about what it is we're supposed to do, that both decreases our experience with the program, but also decreases our efficiency and makes it more likely that people are just going to kind of walk away, right? And so when you can have really clear goals and roles for volunteers, that can really give them a wonderful sense of purpose. Also, being strategic about what you want out of your volunteers is really great when you're thinking about, you'll probably want to have a couple of different volunteer roles within your program, right? Not every volunteer that can be of real value to your work is going to want to, you know, for example, answer the crisis hotline, right? There are some folks who are perfect for that, but then there are some folks who aren't, but who may have other skills and talents that are really valuable and could really help you. And so when you're strategic about your goals, that gives you some time to think about what those different roles might be. You can think about that also in terms of your mission, right? What is the way to really tie your volunteer program back to your mission? Again, that's going to help with clarity of purpose for volunteers. That's going to help you when you're justifying the time spent with volunteers on grant reports or with your board members or anything like that. So it's just great to be really clear with how your volunteers tie into your overall mission and goals. And this is something that I experienced when I was working in a direct service program, is that volunteers can provide some really valuable feedback. You know, sometimes volunteers have the time and space to maybe create deeper relationships with survivors, or maybe they just, because they're in a different role, you know, sometimes volunteers are seen as having less authority, so they might seem less kind of scary or intimidating to folks we work with. So there are lots of reasons why volunteers might get different information than you might get as a staff person of a program. And so it's really wonderful to be able to get that feedback in a different way, and that can be another value added by volunteers in your program. So a couple of things to consider when you're thinking about what you want your goals to be. These are just to help you really come up with some ideas, and I really recommend just grabbing pen and paper when you set some time aside to work on your volunteer program and just writing out some quick answers to these questions. You know, what do you need, right? Talking to your staff, talking to survivors in your program, like where are there are holes or gaps that are really causing a lot of stress and anxiety, both again for survivors and for staff. What are those things? List them out and think about ways that some volunteer goals might be able to help you close that gap. And also, this is a great time. Most likely, you probably already have volunteers in your program. What's working and what's not working, right? Who are your volunteers? If you think about a successful volunteer in your program, what's going on with that person? What makes them successful? You know, how have they contributed? All of those kinds of things can help you set your goals. Also, key thing to think about, who's going to be dedicating some time to volunteers, right? So volunteers are a great return, but you have to put in a little bit of work. Maybe not as much work as you think, right? Especially over time, it's more lifting up front, but if you develop a really great system, and if you create clear expectations, goals, all of those things, and you get some volunteers enrolled, in a lot of programs that I've worked in or that I've worked with, I've seen volunteers who had great training and support go on to be leaders within the volunteers, whether they're, mentoring new volunteers or helping you with your training, or they can really become those folks, right? So if you spend some time up front, hopefully your time overall can decrease because you're building up these new leaders in your organization. Think about who in your staff is a good person to work with volunteers. Both personality fit, right? So, having somebody who really loves working with and teaching folks is a great person to have working with volunteers, but also how does that fit into their other roles, right? Most folks don't have the luxury of having a full-time volunteer coordinator. If that is something you have, that is fantastic. That's a great way to build that. But a lot of times that's not really something that we can invest in when we have a smaller staffed program. So who is going to do that? And then think about how you can shift their other responsibilities so that volunteers are not just like an afterthought, but they're truly an integral part of their employment work, their outcomes, and that will support both the volunteers and the staff in that. And also think about how your board's going to be involved, right? So board members are volunteers. Even if they're not doing direct service, they're a volunteer in this organization, and there may be a member of your board who would be a great person to help you support in some capacity, whether that's training or supervision or whatever it is. They might be a great resource for you for volunteer support. And here's what I was talking a little bit about earlier, like volunteers can do a lot of different things, right? We tend to focus on kind of the crisis services because that is, such a core part of our work. And absolutely, right? Like having volunteers who are able to answer the crisis line is really amazing. When I was a shelter manager, we had a really strong, the program was big enough that we had a dedicated volunteer coordinator, which was amazing. And because of all of the hard work that she put in, we were able to have on-call volunteers take on-call from staff over holidays, right? So, that was a huge benefit, right? For years, staff who was on call over holidays had to answer the phones during those times if there was a call, but volunteers were able to step into that role. And those volunteers that she worked with and identified just found immense pride, and really, like, that was something they look forward to every year, is providing that coverage, because it meant so much to them to be able to give some true time off to the staff that they worked with. It felt amazing for those volunteers who wanted to do that. So that is absolutely a great option. But then there's also a ton of other things, right? So maybe answering crisis calls is really overwhelming for somebody, and maybe that's not where their skills lie, but they have handyman skills or handy person skills, right? They can fix things, or they can paint rooms, or they can work with children, or whatever it is, right? Be creative. Volunteers don't all have to do the same thing, and the more that you're able to really fit a volunteer with an activity that's meaningful to them and also a good fit for the skills, the better outcomes you'll have. And so to tie in with that, I really, this is one of the things I feel strongly about, because I've seen it done both ways, right? So I've worked in an organization where we had really solid volunteer training, but we didn't have job descriptions. And then I worked at a place that had both really solid training and job descriptions. And I really see that the job descriptions are a really important touch point, right? So for some volunteers, they're going to look at it at the beginning of their work and, that's great, they're going to move on. But if you ever, and when we get to challenging volunteer situations, having that job description in place is really crucial in navigating some of those challenging situations. Also, a job description allows you to be really upfront and transparent right away with volunteers, and that will save you time, right? You don't want to waste time with folks who are not going to be able to fulfill your goals, right? I would argue that there's a lot of different things you can have a lot of different types of volunteer work, but if you are identifying a really big need and you want to focus your volunteers on that need, you know, a job description kind of allows people to screen themselves out of the position, right? So if you need volunteers to answer your crisis line, and that is the only thing you're currently taking on volunteers for, that's not going to be for everybody. And by looking at that job description before they apply or contact you about volunteering will save you time in the long run. So volunteer job descriptions, they should look a lot like your employee job descriptions, right? So, and I think it's especially true with community-based advocates. So, you know, the statute in Colorado that establishes privilege for community-based advocates, so they don't have to disclose confidential information about survivors, applies to volunteers and employees the same, right? So I would argue that folks who are working in community-based domestic violence and sexual assault organizations, those volunteers have a little bit of a higher responsibility, and they have a little more complexity in their work potentially than, you know, it's not going to a community garden one afternoon a month where you just show up and they tell you what to do, right? There's training, and there's a lot of time that we put into working with volunteers, and it's definitely worth it, but we don't want to do that if it's not a good fit with the individual, or if it's not what they're looking to do. So volunteer description should have all of these things, and there's a sample one at the link that I put in the chat box, and that's just a jumping off point, right? So take that, edit it, modify it, make it work for your program, but that's just a good reminder of some of the things. You want to be clear about what your expectations will be. Like, do you need folks to commit to, you know, a 3-hour shift every week, or whatever it is that you're meeting your goals? And you can be really clear in your volunteer job description what those goals are, because you took time during the first step to establish what those goals are going to be for your program, right? So each of these steps really build on each other. So you're going to be radically transparent as possible about what the work entails that you want the volunteer to do, any skills or qualifications that you want. This would be great, you know, if you're looking for folks who have experience doing activities with children, or have experience, you know, working with folks who English is a second language, or, you know, whatever it is that your goals are, you know, really list out those skills and qualifications. But also, as a reminder, and I think this applies to when you're thinking about employee job descriptions, there's a lot of ways to have that experience, right? So, you know, every once in a while I'll see volunteer job descriptions that include some kind of educational qualification. I would really recommend targeting it towards skills more than education, right? Because universities, education, they're all radically different, and everybody comes out there with out of those programs with a different set of skills. So really target your required or your desired qualifications in your volunteer job descriptions for those skill-based activities. Be upfront in the job description about what kind of training is required, right? So for domestic violence advocates, it's going to be a minimum of 15 hours before they can work with survivors, and for folks who are sexual assault or in dual domestic violence and sexual assault programs, that's going to be 30 hours. So you're going to be upfront with your volunteers, like, this is going to take a training commitment, and hopefully that will get you to the folks who are really ready to make that commitment. Talk about how long you want folks to volunteer with you, or how many hours a week, or what that's going to look like. Tell them what kind of support you're going to offer them if they become a volunteer. So do you have quarterly volunteer meetings, or do you have our volunteers assigned a mentor, or whatever it is? Let them know that you're going to provide training and support for their work, and that will help them really understand the commitment that they're making. And then any other kinds of things that volunteers will receive for their time, right? We can't pay volunteers, but we can give them things of value in other ways, right? You know, for a lot of volunteer programs that utilize social work interns or social work students, you know, letters of recommendation, experience, you know, mentorship from somebody else in that field, that could be really valuable for somebody. Or is it that they're going to get to build meaningful connections with other people in their community? Or is it that they're going to get to spend time with kids? Or, whatever it is, think about what you see as the benefits of becoming a volunteer in your program and communicate that with folks in the job description. This is tiny text, but this is just a sample job description. You have the Word document at that link, and so that will just give you can copy and paste this and just go to work editing this document to make it work for you. You could also consider starting with one of your employee job descriptions and then making changes to tweak it for your volunteer. That could be a good way to start as well. So the next step is to create a training plan, right? And you're going to communicate this in your job description. But you really want to think about how and when you're going to train your volunteers and what kind of support you're going to need from staff and other folks to make that happen, right? Because it is, again, we're kind of in a unique position as nonprofits that provide services to folks who experience domestic violence and sexual assault, because there are higher standards that we have to meet than some other volunteer programs. And so we want to prepare for that, right? You want to think about how you're training, who's going to do it, where it's going to happen, how it's going to fit into the workload of the staff that have to do it, right? Some programs, there's a lot of different ways to set up your training program, but if you're going to, do it all at once or something, you're going to want to think about how to shift other responsibilities from the staff who are going to be involved in that during that time, and how you're going to cover that time. So training plan needs 15 hours or 30 hours, and those have to be complete before the person has direct service contact with a survivor. So that is true, but that does not limit shadowing. It's best practice, like if you could do this all at once before anybody's even anywhere near a survivor, that's awesome. If you have volunteers who are maybe shadowing a staff member while they're on a crisis call, we'd have them sign the confidentiality agreement before, but they could still, partway through their training, they could still do some shadowing or on-the-job training to support their learning about that. And I think that that's really great. A great option, if you have the time and space and capacity to do that, is to do your initial hours, your 15, 30 hours, and then have an additional on-the-job training component. So that involves shadowing, working with somebody, looking at real client files, all of those things. That is best practice. And so anytime you can get to that place, that's really great. And having 30 to 40 hours is really great if you can manage that. And some of those hours can be that on-the-job training. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slides, but for folks who are funded by the DVP, the Domestic Violence Program at the state, you're going to need a record storage plan for your volunteers as well. So think about where are you going to keep volunteer files and how you're going to keep them. Best practice is to have one file that has all your general volunteer personnel information in it, and a second file for every volunteer that just has records of their training in it. That way, if you say, for example, you're subpoenaed to testify about a survivor, you respond to that subpoena saying, we're not going to answer this because we fall under this domestic violence provision of confidentiality. We have privilege in this case. Nowadays, a lot of times, lawyers are getting more savvy and they're saying, okay, if you have this privilege, you have to prove it, right? So that would mean that you would need to share with the court your training records. And so it's much better if you have a file that just has separate training documents here. You can see that just includes the volunteer's name or like a number, if you name a number, if you use like a file number in your system, and then just the information about the training. So that would be what day it was, who did it, what was the topic, and they did this. And if you're using, like, for example, if you're using our online learning system, you can print off certificates from that. So you can literally just print off the certificate, put that in the volunteers file. You can create certificates for your own programs, really easy. Word documents just have like a certificate template that you can click on and just type folks' names in and the information and print it off, and that's a great way to store too. You also have, if you're using like an electronic system, so like Salesforce Cafe also has some ability to store some of those documents as well, if that's helpful for your program. So you're also going to want to think about in your training plan what kind of continuing education is going to happen. What do you expect from volunteers moving forward as they continue in that? Do you have quarterly meetings? Do you have, you know, a couple of hours a year of additional training that's required? You know, whatever it is that you need, make sure that goes into your training plan and make sure that gets communicated in the volunteer's job description. Think about, you know, this is an idea. It's not going to work for every program, but is there a way that you can build mentorship into your program? That can be super valuable. You know, we find more and more that people really thrive when they have somebody to connect with that can really show them the way. And I don't know about you, but like I remember the first time I started out in the domestic violence field as a volunteer, I remember being pretty terrified for my first couple of weeks. Like it was just very different than anything I had ever done before. I'd never worked in a crisis situation. I'd never answered a hotline call before. And so having mentorship and support from another volunteer or from a staff member really made the difference for me, right? It was somebody I felt like I could ask what seemed like to me were stupid questions, but probably were actually important questions. But somebody I could ask questions to that I didn't feel embarrassed about, somebody I could watch interact with survivors and learn from. All of that is really great. So think about if there's a way you can add some sort of mentorship component into your program. I encourage you to do that. Also, I will say that like with most things, your training plan can be evolving over time, right? So maybe your initial training plan is that you want to get 5 new hotline volunteers who can help out on nights and weekends to relieve your staff so that they can do, you know, so that they don't have to be on call as long, or whatever kind of relief that is for you. So maybe your initial training plan is that you're just going to do 1 30-hour training a year. You're going to try and get a minimum of 5 folks through that, and that's going to be how you're going to move forward. And then maybe as that grows, you can change and update. Maybe eventually you're able to include some mentoring in your program. So you don't have to do it all at once, and your training plan can include that. And I encourage you, if you take a look at your situation, you're like, I really can't build mentorship into this program right now, list that in your training plan as a future goal, if that's something you want to work towards. And that goes with all of these. What can you add in there to work towards in the future? A couple of things, if you are funded by DVP, volunteer policy requirements. And so this is a quick list of these. DVP has wonderful policy templates for all of these things on their website. You can download the template, plug in your name, and it's good to go. Things that they require, but I also think even if you are not a DVP funded program, I think these are really great things to have in your volunteer policy. And you can still, the policy templates are on their website and they're open for everybody, and they're great. And so I really recommend looking at those even if you're not funded by them. And all of these policies would go into a handbook or documents that you provide to folks during their training. So ethics policy regarding volunteer-client relationships and professional conduct, a whistleblower policy, you know, this involves, you know, if folks are reporting unethical or illegal behavior done by the program, that they're not going to be retaliated against. Harassment-free volunteer environment policy, always a great thing to have. A grievance policy, like put down in writing where somebody goes if they're struggling. And, you know, of course, that can start with go to your volunteer supervisor or go to the person who is in charge of your training. If that doesn't work, you can escalate it to their supervisor. You can escalate it to the executive director. You can, you know, it can include those different steps. Criminal background check, right? So required, just like with staff, that's required. If the person is going to have any contact with children, they also need to go through the Trails registry, which is now available to domestic violence programs again. So if you have any trouble with that, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to connect you to some resources with that. So having contact with children is pretty broad, right? So I would say if a volunteer is going to be in your shelter, you would want to do that Trails check on them because you never know when a family might be there, those kinds of things. Or if they're going to be doing community presentations or school presentations, things like that, you'll definitely want to make sure you have that Trails registry check as well. And then include, just information about drug-free workplace, right? Clarifying that for volunteers, right? What that looks like, especially in Colorado, when we have things that are legal here that may not be other places, but we can't allow them in our organizational spaces, even if they are legal, because of our federal funding. So you just want to be really clear with volunteers about that. And then including at least annual performance reviews of volunteers. This is best practice, but it's also a DVP requirement. I really encourage that. And it doesn't have to be, with our employee evaluations tend to be really formal and intense, but it just has to be a performance review. So that could look different. Maybe you use the same. I don't think it would be bad to use the same one that you use for employees or the same system, but you could also develop a specific volunteer one that's maybe a little bit more informal. But having those set times to have a dialogue about how it's going for folks can really help with that. So obviously our online learning center, which will be back up and going by Monday. So I apologize if you've tried to access it this week. We've had a problem with our server, but it'll be good to go on Monday. We hope. It should be, definitely will be. I'm crossing my fingers. Great way to allow volunteers to get some training at home, right, on their own time. This can be really great, especially if you are thinking about how you're making space within your duties, within your employees' duties, and you're like, I don't have any space left to give, right, for training. The Online Learning Center can really, really support that. There isn't a requirement for privilege laws that the training be in person or online. Like, there's no distinction. It just has to be the training. So in theory, somebody could get all 15 hours of a domestic violence program, all of their hours through our Online Learning Center. We have 22 courses now, and each one is at least an hour of credit. Some of them are, up to 2.5 hours. So they could get their whole 15 hours that way. And then you could start them on the job training, right? Of course, in a perfect world, best practice is to have some in-person training because that builds relationships with your staff, it builds relationships with other volunteers. You really get a sense of how they work. So you'll definitely want to have some kind of in-person component to it, but don't hesitate to kind of combine the two. Do a little bit of online stuff. You could do foundational work online, have them take understanding domestic violence, understanding abusers, trauma-informed survivor-centered advocacy, whatever these foundational courses are, and then you can do a little more of the advanced work in person, right? So that can support you and hopefully take a little bit of the burden off of that. Another thing, we'll be sending out a lot more details about this the first week of February. We're just confirming our final location. So in April, Violence Free Colorado, we're going to be offering a Train the Trainer for staff and advocates at domestic violence programs or dual programs to learn more about training advocates, right? So this will apply both to training staff, but also to volunteers, right? So if you have a staff person who you've identified, like, I really think this person could step into a role and spend a little bit of time every week or, at certain points throughout the year, training and supervising and supporting volunteers, this will be a great foundational training for that to get them prepared for that. We'll have some travel reimbursement available, so just keep an eye out if you're on our newsletter list. You'll be the first to know when this registration opens, and it'll be free. So after you do your training plan, also one more thing I want to say before we go on to the recruitment plan is also that we provide in-person training for staff and for volunteers, right, as Violence Free Colorado. So if there is an area, a certain kind of training that you're really struggling to find resources for in your community or provide internally, isn't addressed on the Online Learning Center, feel free to reach out to us and we can talk to you about, what some of our capacity is. And we may be able to, travel and do some in-person training. We also can do custom webinars, right? So, for example, responding to law enforcement and subpoenas, right? That's a really challenging topic, and we can spend a lot of time diving into that. So we do custom webinars about that. So, if you've got an area or you're, struggling in an area, please reach out to us. And we'll do our best to meet that need and or get you connected with other folks who can help with that. So a recruitment plan, right? So you've got your other steps in place. You've thought about what your strategic goals are. You've used those to craft your volunteer job description. You've used those goals and what you want your volunteers to do to craft your training plan. And you're including in your training plan things that will help volunteers execute their job description. So now that you've done all that work, you need to think about how are you going to get and access volunteers. And so that would be a recruitment plan. And with all of these, the title like recruitment plan or strategic goal plan, like that sounds really fancy and formal, but it really can just be a Word document with your ideas and your goals in it. You don't have to use a fancy format, but just having them written really does have some power to help you stay on track and meet your goals with your volunteer program. So a recruitment plan. Here are some strategies, and these are from the University of Kansas Community Organizing Toolkit. So these are some great strategies for thinking about how you're going to recruit in your community. And this is where it's going to be very community specific, right? So what works best in your town and the area that you serve, but these are just some places to start researching. Schools, right? I used to work in a university town at a domestic violence program, and I don't know, 70% of our volunteers or so were college students or recently graduated, or that kind of, they were related to the university in some manner. And that can be a great thing. Look into community colleges, depending on your project. Is there, you wouldn't want somebody under the age of 18, for example, answering the crisis line, but maybe there's a volunteer group at your local high school who can, paint your administrative building, or, whatever it is. Think about what would be appropriate for those groups. But universities, senior organizations, obviously we've got a big generation who's moving into retirement right now, and a lot of them are really service-minded and civically minded, and so it's wonderful to be able to tap into any kind of senior organizations, retirement groups, Kiwanis Club, whatever it is in your community, and give them an opportunity to do some really meaningful volunteer work. So define target groups to recruit. So think about your town, who potentially survey your current volunteers. Like, think about where they came from. A lot of times, some of your biggest champions are going to be your current volunteers, right? Especially folks who have been around for a year or more, right? They've really invested in your organization, and they're going to be able to really kind of communicate why it's important for them. And I think it's really helpful for potential volunteers to hear from somebody else who's in that position. So define, some of your target groups that you want to recruit, and then think about how you tailor your message to them, right? So, if you want to recruit college students, if that's you want to target for your next training class, that's going to be different, right, than if you want to target seniors, right? Those strategies and tactics are potentially going to look different. Or you want to think about if your goal is to have a lot of different types of folks, which I think is a really great way to do a volunteer class. If you want to have college students and retirees and working parents and all of those different kinds of folks in your class at once, you might want to think about, what are the ways you can reach them, and you might have to use some different strategies to reach them. Recruiting volunteers is a great thing for a current volunteer to do, right? Not just telling their story and communicating their story, but actually like doing a lot of the legwork that can take some of the burden off you. If you have a volunteer that you're working with already, can they do some of the social media posts? Can they go to some community meetings? Can they put up a flyer at the library? Or, whatever it is, that work that has to be done to recruit folks, lean on your volunteers for that. And then I think every program can think about, we tend to get into our habits. What are these groups and communities that we target, and how can we mix that up a little bit, right? Survivors are best served when we have involvement from our whole community. And so that can be a really great way to involve community members who maybe haven't been a part of the community in the past. My own experience, we had, I lived in a town that didn't have a big Muslim population. And so we at our shelter had not thought about the ways in which we weren't supporting Muslim survivors in our everyday work, right? So we had a volunteer went through our recruiting class, and then she pointed out like some of our food storage policies and the way that we gave survivors access to some of our refrigerators and things like that didn't actually support folks being able to, practice their religion in our shelter. And, that was something we hadn't thought about before. And that volunteer was just tremendous, right? And gave us incredible feedback that we were able to incorporate so that we were doing better to serve all folks. And so the more diversity you have in your volunteer class, the more you're really going to be able to help all survivors, and that can be a really great way to target some of those areas that you've noticed you're deficient in. So a volunteer application, right? So there is the piece of recruiting, and then there's that conversion into an actual volunteer, right? So you want to do some recruiting, and then you also want to turn that person into an actual volunteer. And so a lot of that has to do with your volunteer application. I really recommend having a standard volunteer application that you use. It's really helpful in collecting information about the volunteer, about what their skills are. It's also a great way to communicate that you are willing to make your volunteer program accessible to people with disabilities, right? So if you have somebody who's interested in volunteering, maybe they're looking at your application online or they got a paper one, and you don't mention at all accessibility or things like that, that might raise some red flags for them. But you have on your application, we want anybody we want everybody to feel like they have a chance to volunteer here. Is there something that you would need support with while you're in our volunteer program? Or, what are your accessibility needs? But that will not only will that get to folks who, might have a disability or language barriers or other things like that, but that will also really support other folks who have things that may not, rise to that level, but that may be really helpful to know, and that will indicate to folks that you care about and want to support your volunteers. So I included some links here to some different programs. The first one is from Tessa in Colorado Springs, and then a couple of other, the Break the Silence DV one, the second link, that has a really great application for volunteers for more administrative type tasks, right? So volunteers can help with data entry, right? They can help with whatever it is that you are wanting support with. So that has some great questions on it you might want to consider if your goals are to have some volunteers that can help you around the office. And so, you know, take a look at those forms, utilize the questions that, you know, ring true to you, to really tailor them to your own organization. You know, and there are some ways, if you don't have, you know, through your existing website, if you don't have an easy way to do a form, Google Forms are free. And, you know, of course, like with any online form, you don't want to collect any super personally identifiable information, which you wouldn't really be doing in a initial application, right? You would get after you've received the application, if you want to move forward, that's when you'd get maybe a little bit more information that you need to complete a background check. And you can do that separately, but a Google form can be, you know, password protected, and you can utilize that for free to create a form or whatever other process works for you, or you can use paper. But if you are targeting, there's a ton of research out there about converting volunteers from interest into actual applications, and having an online form is big for younger generations. Also, I did want to say one more thing about volunteer applications. This is also when you can ask about what the volunteer's goals are, right? So, you know, if you, this is just another check, like with your job description, to make sure that it's a good fit and really make sure that it's a fit that you're ready to invest time into training somebody. And so, you know, if you have your job description out there and it says, you know, it's for, you know, somebody to do an activity with children during the dinner time hour at shelter, so it's easier for the parents to make food, or, you know, that's just an example. So you've identified that you need somebody who's willing to work with children. And so if you have a spot on your volunteer application that has folks' goals and skills on it, then you can really make sure they match up, right? So if you're looking for somebody to do a children's activity while parents are cooking, and somebody puts on there their goals are to get better at building websites or something, you know that it's not a good fit, right? It's that kind of check moment. Also, that is how you make a volunteer program really valuable to the volunteer, is that you help them meet their goals. So maybe their goal, you know, is to help people, right? Is to help survivors because, you know, their mom is a survivor or something like that. Well, then, you know, you can really use that to plug them into a place where they really feel like they're getting meaningful engagement towards their goal. So great way to kind of start that dialogue. And again, it's another way to show that you are going to invest in folks, because you're asking your volunteers to invest significantly in you. And so sharing information about how you are going to invest in them is really helpful. So once you have all of that, you know, you're thinking about what your goals are for your volunteer program, you're developing your volunteer job description, you're coming up with your training plan, you're coming up with how you're going to recruit volunteers. Then the last thing, one of the last things you want to think about is how are you going to retain those volunteers? What are you going to do to make sure that you're not investing a ton of time in folks and then, you know, after a month, you never see them again, right? Of course, that's always going to happen to some capacity. People get sick, people move, you know, it happens. And that's okay. You're never going to have 100% retention. But you want to think about retention as, you know, an investment, right? And having those long-time volunteers can be really, really stabilizing in an organization, and it can be really supportive of survivors. So some tips for retention. So welcoming folks, making sure that folks feel really welcomed. And so this is one of the reasons we talk about having some staff input during your planning phase for your volunteer program can be really great, right? Because, you know, there are times when volunteers can feel like an extra burden on staff. Not that staff don't want volunteers, but if a staff feels like they have to really spend a lot of time and effort and that person isn't working towards a goal that supports that staff person, sometimes there can be a little bit of resentment there, or just not the best experience, right? So if you get some good staff input, and you're tailoring your volunteer program to really meet some of those needs of staff, they're much more likely to be invested. And so, you know, how do we welcome folks into the organization, right? It seems trivial, maybe a little bit, but it's actually really powerful. And, you know, those first impressions that folks have are really lasting and really impactful, right? So, you know, if we, you know, have a initial volunteer meeting where the staff person is really excited, wants to hear a little bit about the volunteer's goals, you know, is honest and open with them about the kind of commitment it takes to be a volunteer in the organization, but says they want to support them in that, right? Like all of those things really matter in that kind of initial welcome. Also just like friendliness and things like that, that's going to make it so volunteers feel better asking questions and bringing concerns to you. And that is retention because, you know, when a volunteer is feeling confused or overwhelmed and they can come to somebody and get clarification and support around that, they're more likely to stick around. If they're feeling confused and overwhelmed, there's also a chance that they're just going to disappear, right? If they don't feel like they have some way to resolve that issue, that could impact them and their retention. Also, challenging volunteers, right? So this goes back to the benefit. You know, for some folks, the benefit is going to be that they're learning new skills and they're trying something that they've never done before. So, you know, how can you provide some of that for them? Appreciate and respect your volunteers, right? Appreciation events, again, can seem trivial, but are actually very, very beneficial. Also, they're an opportunity to build social connections between the volunteers and the staff, right? So if you have, this is an example, I worked at an organization with a wonderful volunteer manager, and she would have root beer floats at the end of every volunteer training class and would invite the staff, right? So of course, staff is really excited about it because they get to take a break and have a root beer float. And she actually arranged for a long-term volunteer often would cover the crisis line during that time. So staff felt like they didn't have to transfer the line to their cell phone and, leave as soon as a call came in or something like that. Like she really set it up so that staff felt like they could participate. And man, that was wonderful, right? So folks were just making root beer floats and hanging out and talking and getting to know each other. And that went a long way to building relationships. Volunteers who participated in those tended to stick around longer. They felt appreciated and supported, and they had that connection to the organization. And so they were much more likely to be, effective volunteers. And again, that goes back to celebration. How can you make it fun and social at times? So offering retention, I've said it before, so I won't spend a ton of time. There's a sample volunteer evaluation here. Check-ins and evaluations, they don't have to be as formal as performance reviews, and you don't have to make them kind of as serious, right? We're all human and we tend to be a little frightened of performance evaluations. Like they can be check-ins and they can be supportive. And so really utilize that to both retain your volunteers and make sure that they're doing the best job they can with survivors. And so real quick, we're going to talk about a couple of difficult volunteer situations. So I tried to think of some that I experience a lot in my work, but this is another point where Violence Free Colorado can support you. If you're going through a tricky volunteer situation and you want to run it past somebody, or you have some questions about confidentiality or whatever it is, give me a call, shoot me an email. I would be happy to support you through your own unique situations. But here are some common ones. So volunteers who no-show or who are not doing the task that they were assigned while they were there, the more work you put in the front end of creating that volunteer application, creating that job description, of training folks, the less likely this is going to be a problem. Sometimes this is a problem just because volunteers aren't clear about the expectations and the goals. So you want to, when you set their schedule, you maybe want to put it in writing or in an email so they really clearly know where they're expected to be, when they're expected to be, and what the process is if they have an emergency or if they're sick. and they need to basically call in for their shift or whatever they're doing. So when you put out the expectations and then you make the expectation that they communicate in some way, if they're not going to be able to come, and make that really clear, that will help. Folks are more likely to do that if they really know you want to do that. You want them to do that. And this is also a great way when staff really understand what the volunteer's role is, when they know that the volunteers have job descriptions too, staff can potentially help redirect the volunteer towards their task, to what they're doing in that time. And so when you make that all clear up front, it's easier to check in and say, hey, remember when we went through training and here's your job description, and you said that you were going to watch the kiddos in the living room, you were going to do activities with them from 5 to 6 every Tuesday evening or something, and that hasn't been happening, or that's not happening right now. Are you facing any challenges, or what's going on? Talk to me about it. Having that job description and that foundation is really important. Also, having volunteers go through that amount of training also gives you a chance to really impart how important it is that we support survivors, right? And sometimes if you don't have experience with domestic violence, it can maybe seem a little less serious, or folks just don't know what they don't know, right? And so throughout training, you've talked to them about why it's important to be trauma-informed. You've talked to them about why it's important to keep confidentiality, right? You've really hit all these marks. And so you can refer, again, back to that training if you're ever facing an issue with tasks or things like that during their activities. Another common challenge is, staff not really fully understanding what the volunteer is doing, or staff feeling like their work with volunteers is what they have to do on a very full job description. And so identifying and making sure that staff knows how and when they're expected to interact with volunteers, making that part of their job description, and thinking about how that impacts their other work, right? Maybe the person who's coordinating volunteers needs to be answering the phones 2 hours less a week because they need that time to focus on volunteers, or whatever it is in your program. Be creative with that, but also be realistic with what the amount of time that staff are putting into, and adjust for that. Have a root beer float party, or have a bowling night, or whatever it is. Have some sort of social interaction, because it's much easier to support and work with somebody when you have some sort of established connection. Again, training, if staff doesn't feel like they have to retrain a volunteer during every single shift, that's going to make a big difference. And you can do some training with staff on working with volunteers. That's something you could think about if you want to do like a staff meeting training, or an in-service, or however it works for you. Talk to staff about working with volunteers. Talk to them about what your expectations are around that. Finally, another common challenge is how volunteers might react to the secondary trauma that they're learning about or experiencing in the work. And this is again, gonna say it one more time, this is why training and getting volunteers in the right positions is so important, right? So when volunteers are expecting, that somebody, that they're a survivor they're working with might share with them part of their really traumatic or challenging story, when they're expecting these things, they tend to handle them better, right? Total human, when we know that this might happen, and when we're giving some tools and strategies to deal with it, it's a lot easier to handle, right? And so volunteers will do better in those situations if you talk about them beforehand, if you do some role playing, if you, have a staff person share a challenging experience that they had with the survivor and how they dealt with it. If the volunteer knows who in the organization they can go to if they're feeling overwhelmed by a situation, all of those things are more likely to help folks with that. Because we know that sometimes reactions to secondary trauma can be things that are really unhelpful for survivors, right? So, sometimes secondary trauma can cause us to really want to be really controlling of a situation and control all the variables because it helps us feel more secure. Well, that's really not helpful if you've got, a volunteer that's, getting mad at a survivor because they took out the trash at 6 o'clock and it was supposed to be taken out at 5 o'clock, right? Like sometimes those secondary trauma responses can manifest in ways that aren't supportive of survivors. And so by talking about it beforehand and including that in training, that can be really helpful. But also understanding, doing in-person training, job shadowing, having your staff work with volunteers, and ask them for some feedback. Sometimes you can tell if somebody is really struggling with the topics in the training, or they're really nervous or scared, maybe direct service isn't the right fit for them. But maybe there's another role in the organization that's really vital that they can help with. And so being willing to change course also can be really helpful. So, if you start working out with a volunteer, they're answering the hotline, they're doing okay, but repeatedly and with some support, they're really struggling with it, maybe it's time to talk to them about some other options for their own, health and well-being. All of those things can help. And again, supporting staff so they know what to do if a volunteer is experiencing some secondary trauma response can be really helpful. So it doesn't, trigger the staff to feel like they're overwhelmed or underprepared for the situation. So I went through that really quickly, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type it into the chat box. And also contact me. I'm going to flip over to, there's my contact information. So if you want to, talk one-on-one about some things that you're experiencing, or if you have questions, that's awesome. Or if you want me to look over, if you write a volunteer job description and you're like, man, I really wish somebody could, just have another set of eyes on this, I'm more than happy to support you through that. So I'm not seeing any questions right now, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to say thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate the work you do. It's amazing how organizations value is so important in different ways, right? So obviously we provide so much value and support to survivors, but offering volunteer options also really invests and provides value to your community. So I appreciate all of the work you do, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. Thanks, everyone.